Okay, today we are going to go over another professor, another linguist, another cultural Marxist, and another one that is famous for changing language. That was what he did. Okay, this very far left wing professor who taught at MIT for years. Okay. We're gonna go through a couple of his things so that you can understand how they manipulate language. Okay, and over a period of time, you'll get to see that a lot of these people literally do not respect anybody else. He is a Khazar. Khazar is somebody, by the way, that calls themselves a Jew but really has no Semitic ties. They come from a source, a area in Eastern Europe that their entire plan was to go into the countries that they were housed in and to destroy them from within, okay, including the United States, and very Luciferian and satanic to the core, and you see it even in today's society. And they use ideologies such as Marxism in order to do so. Okay, let's read a little bit about Noam Chomsky. All right. Avram Noam Chomsky is an American linguist, philosopher. He's a cognitive scientist, historian, political activist, and a social critic. Sometimes called the father of modern linguistics, is also a major figure in analytic philosophy, okay, and of the founder of the field of cognitive science. He holds a joint appointment as Institute Professor Emeritus at MIT and Laureate Professor at the University of Arizona, and is the author of over 100 books on topics such as linguistics, war, politics, mass media. Ideologically, he aligns with anarcho-syndicalism, or what he calls himself, a Libertarian Socialist. Okay. University of Pennsylvania. His spouse, Carol Doris Schatz, Valeria Wasserman. I wonder. But he is one of the people that talks about, or he studies cognitive science, and he also talks about how to steal language and how to use language for the purposes of changing a society. Okay. All right. Institutions. He studied at all of them. MIT, Harvard, now Arizona. Okay. All right, let's see everything else in here. All right. Born to a middle-class Ashkenazi Jew. Ding, ding, ding. In Philadelphia. Just like we were talking about. Right. Why are there so many Ashkenazim? And that their plain intent is to destroy the country that they're housed in. This is something I have been looking for and trying to search, and have been running into walls as I continue my Khazar studies, because they're very good at hiding it. They're good at masking it. But there is a direct correlation between Ashkenazims and destroying countries around the world. Let's look at a couple famous ones. George Soros, Rothschilds, Oleg Deripaska. Okay? All right. Noam Chomsky. Okay. All right. So anyway, let's go over one of his YouTube videos that I pulled up. And it was an eye-opener, but it was very much one that I thought we all should be looking at here. I hope I didn't close out that window. I'd be like, oh no, man. No, there it is. Okay, see? Better than I thought. All right. Let's listen, and then we will stop when we have to.
The libertarian socialist concepts, and by that I mean a range of thinking that extends from left. I think that the libertarian socialist concepts, and by that I mean a range of thinking that extends from left-wing Marxism through anarchism.
Left-wing Marxism, all the way down. Remember, we did the political spectrum chart, the X and Y axis. So we're talking way left-wing Marxism. But Marxism really is an ideology or that pushes socialism closer to communism, okay? And anarchism is its mirror image on the negative Y, negative X axis, okay? They don't believe in government, okay? That line is the X-axis line is the line that north of that line would be people who like a little bit of government, okay? They are the antithesis of it, but at the same time, they are socialist in concept, okay?
I think that these are fundamentally correct, and that they are the proper and natural extension of classical liberalism.
Get that? He thinks they're fundamentally correct. And that it is the extension of liberalism. That it actually is what classical liberalism should be. So he believes that what used to be considered liberalism is not really liberalism. That liberalism really is socialism.
Into the era of advanced industrial society.
So what he has done is he has changed the name to Libertarian Socialism. That way he sounds like, again, he's stealing a term. He's creating a term that sounds less offensive than calling himself a communist. The term communist has a negative image out there, which is interesting because socialists, for many of us, it has a bad image, but for many it doesn't. They haven't associated deaths of hundreds of millions of people. They're like, no, that's communism. Well, what the heck do you think socialism is? Socialism is the economic platform of the very same political and cultural platform known as communism.
Contrast, it seems to me that the ideology of state socialism, that is what has become of Bolshevism.
Bingo. Which is interesting, okay, because state socialism or state capitalism, which is, you can almost call it crony capitalism. Let me go see if I can go back. There we go. To get that exact terminology.
In contrast, it seems to me that the ideology of state socialism, that is what has become of Bolshevism.
Right. Okay. Those are communists, straight up communists. Bolsheviks are referring to themselves in today's society as socialist democrats.
And of state capitalism, the modern welfare.
The state capitalism, crony capitalism.
Our state, these of course are dominant in the industrial countries and the industrial societies, but I believe that they are regressive and highly inadequate social theories, and that a large number of our really fundamental problems stem from a kind of incompatibility and inappropriateness of these social forms to a modern industrial society.
Okay, he's not a stupid man. He's incredibly, incredibly bright. So state capitalism and capitalism that we on the conservatives use are really not that much difference other than the amount of corruption that goes involved with it. Okay, crony capitalists we consider very left-wing, such as Hillary Clinton. Okay.
A French writer, rather sympathetic to anarchism, once wrote that anarchism has a broad back. Like paper, it endures anything. And there are many shades of anarchism, and I'm concerned here only with one, namely the anarchism of Bakunin, who wrote in his Anarchist Manifesto of 1865 that to be an anarchist one must first be a socialist. I'm concerned with the anarchism of Adolf Fischer, one of the martyrs of the Haymarket Affair in 1886, who said that every anarchist is a socialist, but not every socialist is necessarily an anarchist.
Every anarchist is a socialist. And not every socialist is an anarchist. Well, we see that. Therefore, every anarchist, such as Antifa, they're all socialists. Socialists, communists, same platform. So you can actually say every anarchist is a communist. But not every communist is an anarchist. An anarchist is somebody who's going to be a fascist, or they're going to believe in violence. And there are people who are communists that don't believe necessarily in that.
A consistent anarchist must oppose private ownership of the means of production. Such property is indeed, as Proudhon is...
Means of production, property, Marxism.
Famous remark asserted, a form of theft. But a consistent anarchist will also oppose the organization of production by government. I'm quoting. It means state socialism, the command of the state officials over production and the command of managers, scientists, shop officials in the shop. The goal of the working class is liberation from exploitation. And this goal is not reached and cannot be reached by a new direction.
Liberation from exploitation. In other words, the oppressionism. Okay? Liberating themselves from being oppressed. Okay?
And governing class, substituting itself for the bourgeoisie. It is only realized by the workers themselves being master over production by some form of workers' councils.
There we go. That the bourgeoisie must give up their power to the proletariat, and then they end up running your company pro tem. In other words, like what was happening to me in the Netherlands. I owned that clinic. I owned it. I had no right. They could work when they want. They could work as many hours as they want. If they wanted to call in sick, I still had to pay them. They controlled me. I just was the bourgeoisie. They were able to run the clinic how they see fit.
These remarks, it happens, are quoted from the left-wing Marxist Anton Pannekoek, and in fact, radical Marxism, what Lenin once called infantile ultra-leftism, merged.
He called Marxism infantile. Infantile, meaning, what's worse than that? Globalism, perhaps? In other words, is what's even the worst of all what you see these crony capitalists and these, such as what you see in the Democratic Party, they have veered so far into the New World Order that Marxism is considered infantile. An infantile aspect of the very same thing that they're doing. Remember I told you that the left fights with the left. Look at it in the new Congress. You have these three people that are considering themselves Socialist Democrats, a.k.a. Bolsheviks, a.k.a. communists, right?
With anarchist currents. There's an important point, I think, and let me give one further illustration of this convergence between left-wing Marxism and socialist anarchism. Consider the following characterization of revolutionary socialism. The revolutionary socialist denies that state ownership can end in anything other than a bureaucratic despotism. We have seen why...
Despotism. Destruction. So it must end. And that's exactly what you see with these socialist Democrats. They are looking to find ways for capitalism to end.
The state cannot democratically control industry. Industry can only be democratically owned and controlled by the workers electing directly from their own ranks, industrial administrative committees. Socialism will be fundamentally an industrial system. Its constituencies will be of an industrial character. Thus, those carrying on the social activity and industries of society...
Yet the government collects everything from it. That doesn't work. You have a complete society where every single employee owns the company that actually owns them, or that they work for. You get the same mentality. They don't change their mentality at all. Their mentality of laziness, blaming everybody for their problems. Because socialism and this whole postmodernist era that we're in is about blaming everybody else but taking their own responsibility. I went to look for work. I'm a 52-year-old man, and this person said, I cannot hire a younger generation. They just simply do not know how to work. They don't.
Will be directly represented in the local and central councils of social administration. In this way, the powers of such delegates will flow upwards from those carrying on the work and conversant with the needs of the community. When the Central Administrative Industrial Committee meets, it will represent every phase of social activity. Hence, the capitalist political or geographical state will be replaced by the Industrial Administrative Committee of Socialism. The transition from one social system to the other will be the social revolution. The political state throughout history has meant the government of men by ruling classes. The Republic of Socialism will be the government of industry, administered on behalf of the whole community. The former meant the economic and political subjection of the many. The latter will mean the economic freedom of all. It will be, therefore, a true democracy. These remarks are taken from a book called The State, Its Origins and Function.
Well, it really won't be a true democracy, because there will be fighting within the ranks and who actually gets to that position. Just like you see with what we call intersectionality. Intersectionality is supposed to be that what it's supposed to be is, for example, the person that wrote it, Bethany Crenshaw, is like, yes, black people may be oppressed to a point, but black women are more oppressed. Black women, therefore 2 intersectionality points. In other words, gender has a point on race. And what intersectionality does is it creates those who have supposedly more oppressionistic points. Okay, it creates a value system where they sit there and say, you know what, I am the most oppressed, therefore I win. Okay, I have a low IQ, I'm ugly, I'm black, I'm gay, I'm transgendered, and I'm a woman. Holy crap, you win. Rather than saying, no, you are one seriously fucked up individual in the head. They don't want to do that, because then they're trying to consider that subjective. Why? Because this is the era of subjectivity. This is called postmodernism. They never want to deal with objective facts. They have gotten rid of what we call the Enlightenment period. So try to change mathematics from objective science to subjective science. Okay? That's what they did with homosexuality. They needed that period in order to create homosexuality. Homosexuality was created. Well, homosexuality has always been there, but when I mean it was created, what I mean was homosexuality had to be a classification. Once it became a classification in the United States and then went from a minor classification to a regular classification, then they were able to push everything else. Now they're trying to push transgenderism. Once they push transgenderism through, what's next? Pedophilia. Because many of these Khazars are pedophiles. They're pagans.
Written by William Paul in early 1917, just prior to Lenin's State and Revolution, which is his most libertarian work. William Paul was one of the founders of the British Communist Party, later the editor of the British Communist Party Journal. And it's interesting that his critique of state socialism resembles very closely, I think, the libertarian doctrine of the anarchists, in particular in its principle that the state must disappear to be replaced by the industrial organization of society in the course of the social revolution itself. Proudhon in 1851 wrote that what we put in place of the government is industrial organization, and many, many similar comments can be cited. That, in a sense, is the fundamental idea of anarchist revolutionaries. What's more important than the fact that many such statements can be cited is that these ideas have been realized in spontaneous revolutionary action. several times. For example, in Germany and Italy after the First World War, in Catalonia in 1936. One might argue, at least I would argue, that council communism in this sense, in the sense of the long quotation that I read, is the natural form of revolutionary socialism in an industrial society. It reflects the intuitive understanding that democracy is largely a sham when the industrial system is controlled by any form of autocratic elite, whether of owners, managers, technocrats, a vanguard party, a state bureaucracy, or whatever. Under these conditions of authoritarian domination, the classical liberal ideals, which are expressed also by Marx and Bakunin and all true revolutionaries, cannot be realized. Man will, in other words, not be free to inquire and create, to develop his own potential.
All right, so he's calling Bakunin and Marx true revolutionaries. Why? Because they're anarchists? Because they're trying to buck the system, so they create something called the patriarchal system. If you listen to Jordan B. Peterson, he actually debunks the whole patriarchy concept. Okay, and but Marxism wants to always have someone oppressed. You notice that everyone that is on this left side is always angry all the time. Blame daddy for everything. Blame white men for everything. Blame old white men for everything. Blame rich men for everything. Blame men for everything. Okay. But they never want to take responsibility for themselves. It's always about staying in a victimhood mentality. You notice that?
Realities to their fullest, the worker will remain a fragment of a human being, degraded, a tool in the productive process directed from above. Now, the ideas of revolutionary libertarian socialism in this sense, they've been submerged in the industrial societies of the past half century. The dominant ideologies have been those of state socialism and state capitalism. But there's been an interesting resurgence in the last couple of years. In fact, the theses that I quoted from Anton Pannekoek, these were taken from a recent pamphlet of a radical French workers group. And the quotation that I read from William Paul on revolutionary socialism was taken from a paper by Walter Kendall at the National Conference on Workers' Control in Sheffield, England last March. Both of these groups, the French and the English one, represent something significant. The workers' control movement in England, in particular, has developed into a, I think, remarkably significant force in the last few years. It includes some of the largest trade unions, for example, the Amalgamated Engineering Federation, which I think is the second largest trade union in England, and which has taken these principles as its fundamental ideas. It's had a series of successful conferences, putting out an interesting pamphlet literature. And on the continent, there are parallel developments. May 1968 in France, of course, accelerated the growing interest in council communism and similar ideas, other forms of libertarian socialism in France and Germany, as it did in England. Given the general conservative cast of our highly ideological society, it's not too surprising that the United States is relatively untouched by these currents, but that too may change. The erosion of the Cold War mythology at least makes it possible to discuss some of these questions. And if the present wave of repression can be beaten back, if the left can overcome its more suicidal tendencies and build on the achievements of the past decade, the problem of how to organize industrial society on truly democratic lines, with democratic control in the workplace as well as in the community, this should become the dominant intellectual issue for those who are alive to the problems of contemporary society. And as a mass movement for revolutionary libertarian socialism develops, as I hope it will, speculation should proceed to action. Now, it may seem quixotic to group left Marxism and anarchism under the same rubric as I've done, given the antagonism throughout the past century between Marxists and anarchists, beginning with the antagonism between Marx and Engels on the one hand and, for example, Proudhon and Bakunin on the other. In the 19th century, at least, their differences with regard to the question of the state was significant, but in a sense it was tactical. The anarchists were convinced that capitalism and the state must be destroyed together. Engels, in a letter of 1883, expressed his opposition to this idea as follows. The anarchists put the thing upside down. They declare that the proletarian revolution must begin by doing away with the political organization of the state, but to destroy it at such a moment would be to destroy the only organism by means of which the victorious proletariat can assert its newly conquered power, hold down its adversaries, and carry out that economic revolution of society without which the whole victory must end in a new defeat and in a mass slaughter of the workers, similar to those after the Paris Commune. Now, the Paris Commune, I think it's fair to say, did represent the ideas of libertarian socialism, of anarchism, if you like, and Marx, of course, wrote about it with great enthusiasm. In fact, the experience of the Commune led him to modify his concept of the role of the state, as you can see, for example, by looking at the introduction to the Communist Manifesto, the edition of it that was published in 1872, and to take on something like a more anarchist perspective of the nature of social revolution. Well, the Commune was, of course, drowned in blood, as the anarchist communes of Spain were destroyed by fascist and communist armies. And it might be argued that more dictatorial structures would have defended the revolution against such forces. But I doubt this very much. At least in the case of Spain, it seems to me that a more consistent libertarian policy might have provided the only possible defense of the revolution. Of course, this can be contested, and it's a long story, which I don't want to go into here. But at the very least, it's clear that one would have to be rather naive after the events of the past half-century to fail to see the truth in Bakunin's repeated warnings that the red bureaucracy would prove the most vile and terrible lie of the century. He once said, "Take the most radical revolutionary and place him on the throne of all Russia," he said in 1870, "or give him a dictatorial power, and before a year has passed, he will become worse than the Tsar himself." I'm afraid in this respect, Bakunin was all too perceptive, and this kind of warning was repeatedly voiced from the left. For example, the anarcho-syndicalist Fernand Pelloutier asked in the 1890s, "Must even the transitory state to which we have to submit necessarily and fatally be the collectivist jail? Can't it consist in a free organization limited exclusively by the needs of production and consumption?"
No, it cannot. It must be a collectivist. It must be a collectivist jail, as he said. It cannot be in an open free market. It cannot.
All political institutions having disappeared? I don't pretend to know the answer to that question, but I think it's tolerably clear that unless the answer is positive, the chances for a truly democratic revolution that will achieve the humanistic ideals of the left are perhaps rather slight. I think Martin Buber put the problem quite succinctly when he said, "One cannot, in the nature of things, expect a little tree that has been turned into a club to put forth leaves." For just this reason, it's essential that a powerful revolutionary movement exist in the United States if there are to be any reasonable possibilities for democratic social change of a radical sort anywhere in the capitalist world. And comparable remarks, I think, undoubtedly hold for the Russian Empire. Lenin, till the end of his life, stressed the idea, I quote, that it is an elementary truth of Marxism that the victory of socialism requires the joint effort of workers in a number of advanced countries. At the very least, it requires that the great centers of world imperialism be impeded by domestic pressures from counter-revolutionary intervention. Only such possibilities will permit any revolution to overthrow its own coercive state institutions as it tries to bring the economy under direct democratic control. I've mentioned so far two reference points for a discussion of the state: classical liberalism and libertarian socialism. They're in agreement that the functions of the state are repressive and that state action must be limited. The libertarian socialist goes on to insist that the state power must be eliminated in favor of the democratic organization of industrial society, with direct popular control over all institutions by those who participate in as well as those who are directly affected by the workings of these institutions. So one might imagine then a system of workers' councils, consumers' councils, commune assemblies, regional federations, and so on, with the kind of representation that's direct and revocable in the sense...
Get rid of government but have commune assemblies. How the hell is that going to work? Especially with the type of personality. He makes everything sound so utopian, doesn't he?
Representatives are directly answerable to and return directly to the well-defined and integrated social group for which they speak in some higher order organization. Something obviously very different than our system of representation. Now, it might very well be asked whether such a social structure is feasible in a complex, highly technological society.
No.
There are counter-arguments, and I think they fall into two main categories. First category is that such an organization is contrary to human nature. And the second category says roughly that it's incompatible with the demands of efficiency. And I'd like to briefly consider each of these. Consider the first, that a free society is contrary to human nature. It's often asked, do men really want freedom? Do they want the responsibility that goes with it?
We do, but see, when you ask in a subjective way, does man really want freedom? Does man really want to be free and have liberty? No, we're going to take it away from you. Why? Because we subjectively think that man does not need that. Because we're smarter than you.
They prefer to be ruled by a benevolent master. Consistently, apologists for the existing distribution of power have held to one or another version of the idea of the happy slave. 200 years ago, Rousseau denounced the sophistic politicians and intellectuals who searched for ways to obscure the fact, so he maintained, that the essential and defining property of man is freedom. They attribute to man a natural inclination to servitude, without thinking that it is the same for freedom as for innocence and virtue. Their value is felt only as long as one enjoys them oneself, and the taste for them is lost as soon as one has lost them. As proof of this doctrine, he refers to the marvels done by all free peoples to guard themselves from oppression. True, he says, those who have abandoned the life of a free man do nothing but boast incessantly of the peace and repose they enjoy in their chains. But when I see the others sacrifice pleasures, repose, wealth, power, and life itself for the preservation of this sole good, which is so disdained by those who have lost it, when I see multitudes of entirely naked savages scorn European voluptuousness and endure hunger, fire, the sword, and death to preserve only their independence, I feel it does not behoove slaves to reason about freedom. A comment to which we can perhaps give a contemporary interpretation. Rather similar thoughts were expressed by Kant 40 years later. He cannot, he says, accept the proposition that certain people are not ripe for freedom. For example, the serfs of some landlord. If one accepts this assumption, he writes, freedom will never be achieved, for one cannot arrive at the maturity for freedom without having already acquired it. One must be free to learn how to make use of one's powers freely and usefully. The first attempts will surely be brutal and will lead to a state of affairs more painful and dangerous than the former condition, under the dominance but also the protection of an external authority. However, one can achieve reason only through one's own experiences, and one must be free to be able to undertake them. To accept the principle that freedom is worthless for those under one's control, and that one has the right to refuse it to them forever, is an infringement on the right of God himself, who has created man to be free. This particular remark is interesting because of its context as well. Kant, on this occasion, was defending the French Revolution during the Terror against those who claimed that it showed the masses to be unready for the privilege of freedom. And his remarks, too, I think, have obvious contemporary relevance. No rational person will approve of violence and terror, and in particular, the terror of the post-revolutionary state, which has fallen into the hands of a grim autocracy, has more than once reached indescribable levels of savagery. At the same time, no person of understanding or humanity will too quickly condemn the violence that often occurs when long subdued masses rise against their oppressors or take their first steps towards liberty and social reconstruction. Humboldt, just a few years before Kant, had expressed a view very similar to that. He also said that freedom and variety are the preconditions for human self-realization. Nothing promotes this ripeness for freedom so much as freedom itself. This truth perhaps may not be acknowledged by those who have so often used this unripeness as an excuse for continuing repression, but it seems to me to follow unquestionably from the very nature of man. The incapacity for freedom can only arise from a want of moral and intellectual power. To heighten this power is the only way to supply the want, but to do so presupposes the freedom which awakens spontaneous activity. And those who do not comprehend this, he says, may justly be suspected of misunderstanding human nature and wishing to make men into machines. Rosa Luxemburg's fraternal, sympathetic critique of Bolshevik ideology and practice was given in very similar terms. Only the active participation of the masses in self-government and social reconstruction could bring about what she described as the complete spiritual transformation in the masses degraded by centuries of bourgeois class rule, just as only their creative experience and spontaneous action can solve the myriad problems of creating a libertarian socialist society. To He went on to say that historically the errors committed by a truly revolutionary movement are infinitely more fruitful than the infallibility of the cleverest central committee. And I think that these remarks can be translated immediately for the somewhat parallel ideology of the soulful corporation, which is now fairly popular among American academics. For example, Carl Kazin, who writes, "No longer the agent of proprietorship seeking to maximize return on investment, management sees itself as responsible to stockholders, employees, customers, the general public, and perhaps most important, the firm itself as an institution. There is no display of greed or graspingness. There's no attempt to push off on the workers of the community at least part of the social costs of the enterprise. The modern corporation is a soulful corporation." Similarly, the vanguard party is a soulful party. And in both cases, those who urge that men submit to the rule of these benevolent autocracies may, I think, justly be accused of wishing to make men into machines. Now, the correctness of the view, which is expressed by Rousseau and Kant and Humboldt and Luxemburg and innumerable others, I don't think that the correctness of this is the moment susceptible to scientific proof. One can only evaluate it in terms of experience and intuition. But one can also point out the social consequences of adopting the view that men are born to be free, or that they are born to be ruled by benevolent autocrats. What of the second question, the question of efficiency? Is democratic control of the industrial system down to its smallest functional units incompatible with efficiency? This is very frequently argued on several grounds. Some say, for example, that centralized management is a
word salad. Everything's becoming word salad. And that's part of what a lot of these professors like to do. They like to read each other's and they start debating. The thing they don't go through as much is the actual volition of messing with the human mind. They always question everything, but it's all based on the relevance of God. Is there a God? And because they want to put all of their faith into statism, because they cannot get rid of a capitalist society unless they believe in socialism. And socialism and Marxism are hand in hand. And Marxism depends on destroying family values, destroying religion, taking away privatized land, and destroying a nation from within. Those are the four basic concepts of it. Okay? And I needed people to see these people are bright. They're bright. But it's like they take the human psyche and they love twisting it and contorting it in order to feel. It's almost like it's a mental chess game with them. And this is something I see a lot with left-wing philosophers. Okay. They think everyone is not on their intellectual level to actually understand what they're talking about, and you will see that many of these people are Ashkenazims. Okay, and as we start to go through it, it's not Semitic. Okay, it's not anti-Semitic. Because once you start discovering it, you will realize that they don't even have any Semitic blood. So the whole hate speech theory doesn't really work. Okay, it doesn't. Okay, but they like to use things like hate speech, anti-Semitism, in order to gain control and control a narrative. All right. This was important so that you can understand this is the kind of crap that our children are learning when they go to school. So the proletariat, okay. Bad capitalism, okay. Do you think they're going to understand at the depths of what Noam Chomsky is teaching? A few. And those are going to be people that they distort in their minds, so that they can become the next professor and linguists and cognitive scientists who destroy the human mind. It's a sad, sad case that's going on in our society right now. Noam Chomsky, he's satanic. Luciferian behavior down to the core. Okay? But people think he's a genius. Yeah. Be careful.